So in this video lecture, we're going to be examining form processing and data validation in PHP. Now, forms are essential for web applications, whether it's for event registration or login systems or even contact forms. But here's the catch. Without proper validation, forms can be a security nightmare. So by the end of this lecture, you would have learned how to create a form to handle user input, validate input for accuracy and security, and then get an introduction to processing form submissions, which we'll cover in the next module when we integrate our form with our database. So for this lecture, we've got two learning objectives. One, to create forms to handle user input, and the other, to validate input for accuracy and security. So before we start coding, let's answer this. Why do we need form validation? Now, forms collect user input, but unvalidated input is going to be dangerous. Imagine a form that accepts anything. Okay, so is there a possibility of SQL injection? Yes. What about cross-site scripting? Yep. Invalid data breaking of your database? Most definitely. That's why we validate data before storing or processing. So let's get started. Now, if you're viewing this video as part of my advanced web development course, for the milestone this week, you're going to be developing a form for the event registration system using PHP. Now, this is going to enable your users to input data such as name, email, and an event selection. So let's get started building the form. Okay, so let's go ahead and start by creating our form on using our Infinity free hosting. So go ahead and log in into your domain, and then we're going to click on File Manager, and we're going to go into the HT docs, and we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this file register.php. Okay, now to this form, we're going to add our basic, just our basic HTML code first. So let me go ahead and add that. Okay, so I've got my basic HTML structure in here, and I've added a title that says event registration. And I'm going to go ahead and do an auto save and save just so that it can automatically save that. So now we're going to go in and we're going to actually create the code for our form. So I want to have a H2 header that just says event registration, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to create my form element. Okay, and I'm going to I want it to actually the same page here, this register.php. Not only is it going to contain my form to collect the data, but it's also going to be used to process the data. So I'm using the action with the same name here. And then the method that I'm going to use is going to be a post method. So let me go ahead and close my form. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to create my different input fields. Okay, so I went ahead. So if you need to, I'll put a link if you've never built an HTML form and you need a refresher for that. I'll provide some information about that. But basically, I've got labels for each of um, the input um, elements that I have here. So I've got a text element that's going to collect the name. I'm saying that it's going to be required, so it's using that HTML5 in order to validate that something is going to be entered into that box, that input element. I've got an email label for the email input element. I've got a drop down that I'm using for this event rather than having a text box, because I only have 3 events and I don't want anybody to enter anything that doesn't correspond with the information that I want to collect. So, I'm using a select, but you could also use like a radio button or something like that if you wanted. And then I've got my submit button here. So this form is going to collect the name, it's going to collect the email, and it's going to collect whatever the event um, selection is. So we can go ahead, we've saved that, so we can go ahead and test this form just to see if it comes up. Of course, nothing's going to happen when you submit it because we don't really have any kind of um, coding here for it to actually do anything. But let's go here, let's grab that domain, and then we'll pull up a blank, and I'm going to say register. Okay, and so there's my form, there's my drop down. Okay, all right. Now, before we add code to handle the form data, we need to discuss get and post methods in PHP. Now, PHP provides 2 methods through which a client or browser can send information to the server. These methods are get and post. Get and post methods are the HTTP request methods used inside the form tag to send form data to the server. Now, one of the most important things of not just getting web applications, but applications in general, is handling user input. Now, if we're writing a website, say for maybe a storefront, we need to be able to handle user input so that we can display the correct products. Now, the GET requests are probably the most common requests that are made to any web application or just about anything. So if you type something into the address bar and press enter, it issues a GET request, and then the request is just sent, requesting, say, to retrieve the information. Now, the GET request on the surface is very simple, but since they involve user input, we got to be careful. The first rule of user input is not to trust it. So any information that we do not control, we must assume is malicious. Now, the information sent from an HTML form using a GET request is visible to everyone in the browser's address bar, which means that all the variable names and their values will be displayed in the URL. So you can see this example here in gold. Now, this is the primary way that we get information from a GET request, is from what's called a query string. Okay, so therefore, the GET method, like I said, is not secure to send sensitive information. The bold part here, the first name, last name of this sample URL here are the variable names. Okay, and the italicized part, this is the value, for the corresponding variable. Now, there's also a limit to the amount of data that we can send using the GET method, and the limit should not exceed 2048 characters. Now, our application or our website doesn't know these query parameters by default, so we've got to program them in. We'll need to get we'll get more into that a little later, of how we retrieve and say react to the parameters. Now, like the GET method, the POST method is also used to submit the HTML form data. But the data submitted by this method is collected by the pre-defined superglobal variable $_post instead of the $_get, as we discuss here on the slide. Now, unlike the GET method, it doesn't have a limit on the amount of information to be sent. And the information sent from an HTML form using the POST method is not visible to anyone. So the POST method is more secure than the GET method because the data sent using the POST method is not visible to the user. Now, the POST method is useful for sending any sensitive information, again, because the information sent is not visible to anybody. Now we're going to focus on the superglobal variable post to retrieve the data that's entered in our form and then we'll use the post method. So when the user fills out the form shown here in code and clicks the submit button, the form data is sent for processing to a PHP file named welcome.php. The form data is sent with the HTTP post method. Now, PHP provides a special superglobal post array variable in which it stores form data submitted by the post method. It creates an array element of the same name as each submitted form element name, storing the value that they contain. So, for example, on our form for the name element called email, on the submission form, PHP will create an array element named post email containing the value entered into that form by the user. Now, to display the submitted data, you could simply just echo all the like named variables. So the welcome PHP would look something like this, welcome, and then we would echo out the value of this array, line break, your email address is, and then we would echo out the value of this array. Now let's think about security and user experience with our form and see how we can process PHP forms with security in mind. Proper validation of form data is going to be important to protect, our form from hackers and from spammers. Now, this is just a diagram of how our form would work. So say the user would fill out the form and then they would click the submit button. And so then that form data is sent to the web server using the post method, okay, and it's sent to wherever the script is. The script would be here in the action as the action value. And so with that script, the server-side script would then process the posted data and then it would send back the results back to the browser. Now, there's no guarantee that the information provided by the user is always correct. And PHP will validate the data at the server side, which is submitted by the HTML form. So you need to validate a few things. You need to validate, empty strings, validate the strings themselves, validate maybe the numbers, validate email addresses, validate URLs perhaps, and then even validate as far as the input length to make sure that it's exactly what you're expecting. So we're going to walk through some of these in our demo today in order to be able to prepare for your lab if you're watching this in conjunction to the course. Okay, so now let's go ahead and process our event registration form. So we're going to add some code just above the form here. We're going to add some PHP code. That's going to retrieve the data using the global post variable. So PHP, I'll do my closure. So my server-side code, my PHP code is going to go here. So I want this to execute, before the form and everything else. I'm putting it here. So let me go ahead and type some of this and then I'll explain it. Okay, so the first thing that I'm doing is, remember on our form, we have that name element here. So we've got the name elements here, okay? And when we go to submit the form, PHP is going to create that array element for whatever the named. So, remember I showed you in the other slide. This will contain as far as whatever the value that this has up on submission. This one is going to contain as far as whatever this email. So see how this corresponds to it. It's going to name it with the name of the element on the form. It's going to name that array. Okay. And then what we're doing is we're taking the content of that array the value that's entered, and then we're storing it into a variable. So we're creating three variables: name, email, and event. Now, what I want to do is I want to, now once I have these elements, or once I have the values rather within the variables, then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to echo out what those values are. So let me go ahead and do that part. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm echoing, or I'm having it print um, the header, H3 header registration details, and then I'm taking the contents of those variables and just placing it with a label inside of a quote. And you can refer to one of the other lessons about how to um, include variables within the echo. There's a couple of ways that we can do it, but I'm going to do it this way. Okay, so it's going to print out name and then a line break and then the email and whatever the content of that variable, and then the event and content of that. Okay, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and save the file. Now, sometimes web developers may use two different documents to collect and process data. One to display the HTML form and then another to handle the form submission. But we're going to perform this process using a single document by using a simple technique to determine whether the form should be displayed or its submission should be handled. Now, PHP provides a special superglobal server array variable with a request method element in which it stores the type of request. Now, where a form uses the post method for submission, two different types of requests are made to the PHP script when the page loads. Simply displaying the form uses the standard get method, whereas submitting the form uses the post method. Therefore, the request method can be examined to determine which course of action to take. Is this going to be a get method where we're just looking at the page, or was a form actually submitted? And so then we can know which course to take. Now, using this technique, the name of the same single page is also specified in the form's action attribute. And the form can then display the same echo instructions and validate checks right in the same form that it used to collect the data. Now, we'll be using the same file in our handler or our action attribute. Now, as we did, we could simply enter the name of the file like we did, when we were just coding. But what happens if we say rename the file or remove it? Then we have to update the action field as well. But using the PHP self variable, we can write more generic code. Now, sometimes this makes our form open for exploits, but we can still protect our form by encoding the HTML entities. So we add this to the action, and then it's sanitized. So here, the HTML entities function encodes all the characters which have an entity equivalent. This is going to prevent malicious JavaScript code from being executed unintentionally by the web server, or the web browser rather. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the action value in our existing code with this PHP script. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to replace this value with the PHP self. And you can write PHP directly within the HTML. You just have to make sure that you have your script tag, your PHP opening and closing script tag. So we're going to say echo HTML entities. We're using the server PHP self. Okay. All right. So um, now what we're going to do is we're going to add the PHP script to handle this form submission um, so that we can check to see what request method was made and to make sure that before we actually run this code that the request method of post was added. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've gone ahead and added that. So what I'm doing is I'm checking to see if the request method is post, and if the request method is post, that means that the form was submitted. Okay, remember I told you that you could have a request method of get when a page first loads, or when you refresh a page, or whatever the case is. Okay, but you're only going to get the post if you actually on my page if you're actually like submitting this form. So I don't want this code to load just because somebody loaded the page. I only want this code to run, I should say not load, but to run if we actually submitted the form. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and um, add that. And if you notice, I do a lot of indenting. And the reason why I do this is best practice because you could end up with thousands of lines of code, and you're going to have nested code, nested if statements and things like that. And it'll get confusing if everything is like left aligned, with no indents and things like that. It's easier to see, okay, what's nested inside of what, if you do the indents here. Okay, so this code is going to do three things. Okay, one, it's going to check, like I said, to make sure that the form was submitted using a post. Okay, not a get, but a post. And then it's going to capture the data, again, using the post here. And then it's going to print it back to the page. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. And let's go here and let's refresh. Okay, and then let's go ahead and test it. Okay, and see it sent it back to the page. Okay, so everything's working, the way that we want. Now the thing is, what happens if someone enters garbage data in here? So what we want to do is we want to validate the input before we actually start processing it. Okay, now our next step is we're going to add some basic validation. And our validation, we're using this to, we're going to modify our PHP code because we're using it to remove unwanted characters. We're ensuring that the email is valid, and then we're going to try to prevent script injections. Now, some important functions that are going to help with this is the HTML special characters function. And what this does is it converts the special characters into HTML entities to prevent like the XSS attacks. So when a user say submits a form, they might inject, or somebody being malicious may try to inject like some malicious script into the form. So if you load the form that say has been injected without sanitizing it, the browser is going to try to execute the script, which could cause like a potential security issue. So using this HTML special characters, the special characters in the script, like the less than and the greater than signs, they get converted into harmless HTML entities. Now the next function that we're going to use is going to be our strip tags function. And what this does is it removes all the HTML and the PHP tags from a string. So sometimes users might enter like unwanted HTML. And if you want to say remove all the HTML and keep only say the plain text, then you would use this strip tags function. Now, for extra security, we can even combine these, okay? And we can use them to remove like unwanted HTML tags and encode special characters to prevent that XSS. And then the other function is this filter var function. And this can be used to validate and sanitize input values. Now, this is going to require two arguments to specify the variable to be filtered and then the constant name of the filter to be used. So we're going to be using filter validate email, which checks for the email address format. Okay, and then the other filter or the other function that we're going to be using is the trim function. And this just removes like any kind of leading or trailing spaces. Okay, so using those different functions, let's go ahead and modify our code. So I'm going to go up here and I'm just going to um, put a comment. It's always good to comment as well because sometimes if you're working with other developers, they kind of know what it is that you're doing. Sometimes you need to, oh, didn't spell that right. Sometimes you need to actually kind of remember what you did. And then also you can use the comments and things like that to kind of organize your codes and things like that. So we're going to be using like the different functions, on each of um, the information, the input that we have here. And so you can load functions within a function. Okay, you can have a function and have it return something and then use that function inside of as a argument inside of another function and then another function, so on and so forth. And that's what we're going to be doing, rather than like having to write all these different versions down and loading them into the variable. We're going to actually have nested functions. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is going to be our trim function. And remember the trim function, remember that one, it just takes off like any say leading or trailing spaces. So like if somebody typed their name with a space behind it, or they typed a space, left a space in front or whatever, it trims it off because sometimes that can cause errors, or sometimes we just don't want to have that in our system. So the way we write the function is we write whatever the name of the function is, we write the parentheses, and then whatever the argument is goes in between the parentheses, and for the trim, the argument is whatever the value is that you want to trim. Okay. Now the next one that we're going to use is the one that was that strip tags. Remember that one's going to be the one that's going to remove like the HTML and PHP tags from whatever the string is. That's going to be the argument. So this is our string. So we're going to add strip tags. And nobody should be putting any HTML or any PHP in the name text box. Like if I had a blog or something like that, maybe I would want them to put tags or something like that. I'm not sure. But for name and for email and for event, they shouldn't be putting any kind of HTML tags in there. Okay, so it's going to strip it of that. It's not going to allow you to have that in there. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to use that HTML special character. And remember that one is going to convert like the different special characters into HTML entities to prevent like, any kind of attacks or anything like that. So nobody can insert any kind of malicious scripts. Scripts are going to have like, the greater than and the less than signs, like if they're trying to insert some JavaScript or something like that. And it's going to actually take any of the special characters and convert them into like HTML entities. So for instance, like they'll strip out like the greater than and the less than. And so nobody can actually put any kind of malicious scripting in here. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use HTML special characters, the function, and then the parentheses. And then, the results of the other functions are going to be in there as the argument. Okay, so Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so let's just look at it, make sure we've got one, two. Sometimes adding these extra parentheses on kind of gets a little, so it's always best to kind of put things in an order just like I did rather than trying to type it all out. Okay, the next one we're going to be using is that filter var that we talked about. And the filter var function, remember that's used to validate and sanitize like input values. And so it's going to take two arguments. It's going to take whatever the value of the variable that needs to be filtered, okay, which is going to be this post email, this information, that's what's going to be filtered. And then we're also going to add the argument of the constant name of the filter that we want it to use. And we want it to use that filter validate email, okay, because that's going to check for the email address format. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that. So before I add that, I also want to do a trim of this because sometimes people, their email addresses, they may have mistyped a space or something like that on there. Okay, and then next I'm going to use the filter var. And remember that has two arguments, so we separate the arguments with a comma. And the second argument is that constant. Okay, let me just check and make sure I spelled that right. Filter validate email. Okay, and that's the filter var. Okay, and then that's going to get saved and stored into this this variable here. And then for the event, I mean, I could leave it as is because it is from a drop down, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a strip tags because you never know what someone can manipulate on your page. So HTML special characters. Okay, go ahead and save that. Okay, now the only other thing that I want to do is because of the fact that I'm telling it to um, filter, to check as far as if it's going to be a valid email, I do need to check to see if that email was valid. Now, whenever you use this filter var, it's either going to, if it passes, then it's going to return as far as the email string, okay, the valid email string, after it sanitizes it and everything. But if it comes out that this is not valid, okay, if it's not a valid email address, then what it's going to do, it's going to return a boolean of false. So that's what I want to check for. Okay, I want to check to see if the content, because what would happen if this didn't pan out as a valid email, then this is going to contain false. It's not going to contain the filtered email address. So that's what I'm checking for. So I'm going to say check if email is valid. Okay, so I'm basically going to kind of do the check to see if it's false. I'm going to kind of do the exception. So I'm going to say, remember, this is how we check, like something's not. So it's not, true, it's not valid. This is going to return a false. If it returns a false, then I want to send out a message. I'm going to have it show a message. It's going to be in a paragraph format. And I'm going to say color. I want it to be red so it can stand out. And then I'm going to say invalid email address. Please enter a valid email. Okay. All right. And if you notice, this is a mistake that I see a lot of people do. Because we're doing double quotes here, we're doing a single quote around our style value, our style declaration. So if we had done a double quote here, then PHP would have thought we had ended our statement. Okay, so that's the reason why we did a single quote there. So if it's not valid, if this ends up being false, okay, if this returns false, then it's going to print this out. Okay, else then this is where now I'm going to grab this and I'm going to place it in here. Okay, so if this is false, it's going to print this out to say that it's an invalid email address. But if it's true, if it's not false, which is else, then it's going to actually echo out the name, the email, and the event. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. Okay, and let's go and let's refresh this so that we can get the latest code. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put an invalid email address in there so that we can see how that works. Okay, and I'm going to hit register. Oops, wait, what happened? Sometimes it like times out here. So let's go back and see what happened here. Okay, so you see it, see what the problem is. I actually mistyped here. Okay, I wish it would like check this, but it didn't. Okay, so let me make sure HTML special characters. I don't know where that T came from in there. Okay, so let me go ahead and save that. Let me try running it again. Okay. Okay, and so see, I put an invalid email address in there and it gave me that message. So let me try running it now with a correct, we'll just say .com. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to change this to webinar. Okay, and see, it works. Okay. All right, so go ahead, and if you were doing this as part of my class, this is part of the assignment. You can clean it up, add some CSS to it, whatever you want to do. And we'll be working on, kind of adding a little bit more user experience to this, enhancing us as the user experience by adding a little bit more usability, like maybe saving like your values within the form. So if you make an error, you can just go in and easily make a change rather than having to restart it all over again. Now, right now, this form just prints the data on the page, but in our next module, we're going to actually be taking this data and we're going to be storing it in our database. Okay, so other than that, thank you and happy coding.